Well, hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. Hope you're well today. As you can see, well, first of all, I've got a little bit of an inflammation in my lower eyelid. It's called a sty, if you guys are familiar with it. So it might look bad, but don't worry, it's actually well looked after, and it's nothing serious. It should resolve itself within a matter of a few days. In fact, it's already getting better today compared to yesterday. So yes, I have that. In addition to that, I actually happen to have I was convinced I had COVID, but it turns out that it's not COVID. At least the test is negative, so it's probably just a bad cold. So and obviously the two are linked, because this thing is linked to a bacterial kind of interaction with your follicles to the lower eyelid. In this case, apparently, often it's more the upper eyelid. More likely to happen when your system is weaker. In any case, I am feeling better today than I have been the last few days. So let's discuss today's topic. Today I want to talk about or offer some reflections on why INFJs as NI dominant sometimes don't really know what to do with their NI. Sometimes are almost led to doubt whether NI is real at all, and to try to explain where that comes from, whether there might not be a reason why it's simultaneously quite intuitive to relate to the NI function when you're an NI dominant, and at the same time ever elusive. So I'm hoping to offer some original thoughts on this, or some thought-provoking thoughts on this, and I'll be referencing a lot of, fair bit of Jung, and possibly the concept of synchronicity as well, which might be of interest to you, because I believe that this is a concept that a lot of people are interested in, but there's not a lot of very convincing explanations of what this means in Jung's work. So before I move on, just remember that I have written 2 books on the INFJ personality, The Ecstatic Soul. Actually, that's the only book on the INFJ personality I've written. You can check it out, the links below. And this is my novel, The Infinite Castle, which was released last August. Check it out. Less than $10 as well, links below. Okay, so the NI function and why it's actually not so easy for the INFJ to relate to it. Of course, you are going to meet a lot of people on the internet who will speak of relating to the NI function. Something that's quite noticeable, for example, on the INFJ Reddit or subreddit. Now, the thing is that if you're any kind of observant, perceptive kind of person, what you'll start noticing is often people, when they talk to or speak about the experience of relating to the NI function, they'll either speak in platitudes. That is to say, they'll say, oh, I just know things, or I plan super ahead, like 20 years ahead or whatever, like an INTJ kind of mastermind or whatever. This is something that we can't take very seriously ultimately. This is just fiction in every possible sense. And you also have people who, and it's quite common, speak about the manifestations of NI, and when you read about how they describe those manifestations of NI, it's almost impossible to distinguish them from manifestations of any, right? So an example that I've come across and I thought was quite illustrative was someone talking about how as a kid they thought that, in the traffic lights, inside the traffic lights, they were like animals hiding or something like that. Supposedly that was an illustration of NI. Is either an illustration of nothing whatsoever, or more an illustration of any, in terms of, the generation of possibility out of contents that don't appear to have any direct connection with it. So you have either platitudes, meaningless statements, or statements that could just as well apply to either any, or in fact, possibly any perceptive function, and certainly not NI specifically. So in order to get a sense of what an NI manifestation looks like, we first have to, again, drill down on what NI means. And if we rely on the original Jungian definition for NI, it's something that I was reading recently again in his work, in a much later work in Psychology of Types or Psychological Types, which means that, his first of all, his understanding of the NI function had not changed. It had slightly evolved perhaps, but it had not changed in its substance. He talks about the perception of inner contents, the perception of unconscious contents. Sometimes he also calls it the perception of subliminal contents. And it all means the same thing. It means that things that are happening below the threshold of consciousness, somehow when you are a strong NI user, according to Jung, you're someone who is able, from the level of consciousness, because perception, when perception is in a dominant function, obviously it's conscious. Okay, so NI is a conscious function. That's another thing that sometimes people don't get right. They think that NI can be both dominant and unconscious, which is impossible. So NI is, when it's in a dominant or auxiliary position, it's pretty conscious, but it's kind of like it's quite simple. You imagine that you have an observatory, at the top of a hill or a mountain. So, the way that you have observatories like that, these white, often like dome things. Well, usually we think of observatories as looking at as being set up so that the sky can be observed. Well, you have to imagine an inverted observatory where the observatory is looking actually at the interior of the mountain rather than the sky. Right? So that's a nice way of showing the opposition contrast between NI and NE. Okay, so nevertheless, the observatory itself is in the conscious world. Right? So that's what is difficult to completely appreciate and understand about the NI function, and also what probably makes it very difficult for an INFJ and an INTJs too, to fully relate to it in a way that is not either platitudinous, meaningless, or confusing NI and NE or other perceptive functions. Because it's actually not that easy to make sense of a function that is conscious and yet puts you in touch, allows you to perceive unconscious contents from the standpoint of consciousness. No wonder that when you have a definition like this, added to, Jung's characteristically dense, sometimes a little bit elusive way of writing, no wonder that people find it difficult to figure out, is it really conscious? Is it unconscious? What happens when it's dominant, when it's in the lead position? Obviously it has to be conscious, but it's perceiving conscious contents. Yes. Now the thing is that even though the perception is conscious, the contents themselves won't be contents that present themselves to consciousness in the same way that, the contents of everyday experience manifest themselves. When I say everyday experience, I mean everyday conscious experience in the external world, in our relationship with others. Obviously, if I look at, I'm recording this on my phone, I can see my phone, and it's very well delimited. It has all the different kind of proportions and shapes that allow me to call it a phone. Behind that, there is a screen, there is a window out there, there is a sky, there are blinds, there are posters on the side. There's a laptop down there. There's a Nintendo Switch. Here's a jumper, so all these contents are determinate, right? They are definite. Definiteness, determinacy. These two aspects are characteristics of the conscious domain, the domain of experience. So the domain of conscious experience, I should say. Because you can also talk about unconscious experience, but let's leave this aside. So one way of also linking that to the concept of the libido is that, libido being psychic energy, is that if a content is charged with enough psychic energy, then it becomes determinate. And if it's determinate, it's conscious, right? So consciousness, when we speak of the threshold of consciousness, we speak of being above a certain threshold of psychic energy being invested in a particular content. So we have these subliminal contents that are usually not invested with enough psychic energy to be available, to conscious representation. That applies to things we've forgotten. So lost memories, which are never really lost, but they are falling down in the unconscious. Now, it can happen that they are so deprived of psychic energy that they can never be brought back to consciousness. But the idea for Jung is that you can never actually completely lose your memories. They just fall down in the unconscious and then are inaccessible to consciousness. Subliminal perceptions of things. You know, if you walk down the street, there's a car that passes by, maybe you're focused on listening to music or a podcast. Someone is driving the car, a woman with a red jumper. Well, you know, you don't notice that in the conscious field, but as a subliminal perception, it will find its way into the unconscious. And then in the unconscious, you know, what does not pertain to the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the forms, the forms of the possibility of behavior, the forms that represent the patterns of possible attitudes and behavior in the world. So these are the archetypes. Also not representable because not determinate with enough psychic energy that, you know, it could be made an object of consciousness. So in the case of Ni, what's really difficult and problematic, and it really, I think, explains why it's hard for INFJs to quite give an account of it, any Ni dominant to give an account of it, and even like an Ni auxiliary, you know, could have strongly developed Ni. Hard to give examples, because by definition, examples require that you share a content with someone that is determinate enough that this person can recognize it as such. But these contents that we Ni leads perceive are actually not determinate enough because they're unconscious, whether they're archetypes, subliminal perceptions, and so on. So it's almost as if the only way in which the Ni lead function manifests itself is by its impact, the impact of its, you know, of this perception of contents on the INFJ, rather than the INFJ's ability to impart contents which by definition cannot be imparted because they evade representation, because they don't have enough libido charge and not enough determinacy. Okay, they are fuzzy, they blur into each other. It's characteristic of the unconscious, which leads us to prescience, you know, which is a concept that I have in my book. You know, say like Ni often manifests itself as prescience. That is that an INFJ will not come forward and provide evidence. Oh my God, I have these unconscious contents. I need to tell you about these guys. It's impossible, because otherwise you've turned them into conscious contents and they're no longer what they really are as you perceive them. But prescience is more a way of relating to the world as if you have a sort of pre-conscious or a mild precognition of things as they are happening, of how you come to acquire knowledge of things. You give often the impression with other people of a certain kind of wisdom because you're less surprised by things in some sense than they might be, and you're less surprised because the perception has already happened subliminally via Ni at the unconscious level. Of course, there's still an element of surprise when, you know, if an event comes to take place and it materializes something that could not have been in the unconscious before, because it is now fully determinate. But there is a link there which might explain the lack of surprise, the expectation, and a sense of wisdom and knowing that comes with that. It's a prescience rather than a form of definite knowledge. Okay, so it's more the Ni behavior of the INFJ or the INTJ is often more manifested through how it affects their behavior, the attitude towards the world, the disposition, their character, their slight otherworldliness with others, than it would be about them being able to provide evidence of Ni use. And usually when they provide evidence of Ni use, because that requires making conscious unconscious contents, usually, you know, it either slides into meaninglessness or into description of functions that are actually extroverted functions usually. So often NE or SE, as the case might be. Now, the link with synchronicity is an interesting one, because I think that synchronicity itself is almost impossible, I think, that anyone else than an Ni dominant could have come up with this concept. And I really think that part of why it is so difficult to accept, to appreciate, and not to deride, is because if you're not a Ni dominant or someone who's strongly Ni developed as an auxiliary, the sense of it, the meaning of it, the truth of it is almost not worth attending to, which brings us to a certain kind of relativism, which we have to also be mindful of and beware of. But this is something that I might cover in another video, perhaps tomorrow if there is interest. We'll see. Let me know what you think in the comments. And yeah, you know, I will see you tomorrow, and there's no doubt I'll be feeling even better by then. All right. Hope that was interesting, guys. Let me know what you think. Don't forget, you can also support me on Patreon, the link below. Helps the channel. Really appreciate my supporters. See you soon. Bye-bye.